The day my father stopped smiling was the day the light in our house dimmed forever. He used to be the kind of man whose laughter could fill a room. Deep, warm, and contagious. Every evening he would come home with a story from work, some funny mishap or a small victory, and we'd all sit around the dinner table, waiting to hear it. My mother would smile quietly as she served him his favorite meal, and I'd listen, trying to memorize the sound of his joy. But one winter evening, everything changed. He came home later than usual, his steps heavy, his face pale. There was no laughter that night, no story. Just silence, and a faint tremor in his hands as he reached for his food. We didn't ask questions. Maybe we were afraid of the answers. Days turned into weeks, and his smile, the one that had once held our family together, disappeared completely. My mother tried to fill the emptiness with prayers and patience. I tried with jokes, grades, and achievements. Nothing worked. Something deep inside him had broken. Something I couldn't see but could feel in every quiet meal and sleepless night. It wasn't until much later that I learned what had happened, the truth behind the night my father stopped smiling. It wasn't about money or health, as we'd assumed. It was about loss, guilt, and the weight of something he couldn't forgive himself for. That truth changed the way I saw him, not as the strong, unshakable man I'd idolized, but as a human being who had once carried too much love and too much pain. And in understanding his silence, I found a way to heal my own. It began on an ordinary Monday morning, the kind of day that looked no different from the hundreds before it. My father left for work wearing his usual brown jacket, his lunchbox tucked neatly under his arm, and a faint whistle escaping his lips. I remember watching him from the window as he waved at me before climbing into his old blue truck. The sun was barely up, and the frost on the windshield caught the morning light, scattering it like tiny diamonds. Back then, I never thought about how fragile happiness could be. I never imagined that something as simple as a day at work could change a person forever. He worked at a small construction company on the edge of town, the kind of job that required both muscle and heart. My father had plenty of both. He wasn't just a laborer. He was the man people turned to when something went wrong. A beam misaligned, a safety line tangled, a worker injured. He was the one who kept everyone calm, the one who said, "We'll figure it out." And they believed him. Everyone did. That morning the site was busier than usual. They were working on a new community center, a project my father was proud of because it would stand where an abandoned factory once did. He had often said that the building would bring life back to the neighborhood. His best friend, David, worked alongside him, two men who had known each other since childhood, who shared stories, lunches, and laughter every day on that dusty site. But by noon, laughter had turned into screams. The details came to us later, in broken pieces from my father's co-workers and a trembling call from the site manager. A cable had snapped while a steel beam was being lifted. The sound, they said, was like a gunshot, a violent crack that echoed across the half-built walls. David had been standing below, checking the alignment, when the beam swung loose. There was no time to react, no warning, no second chance. It came down fast, and when it stopped, the air was filled with dust and horror. My father had been only a few feet away. He had shouted David's name, had run toward the chaos, but by the time he reached him, it was already too late. The weight of that moment, the beam, the silence after, the sight of his friend's still body pressed down on him in a way nothing else ever could. He told no one what he saw exactly, but I saw it later, in the way his hands shook when he tried to light a cigarette, in the way his eyes lingered on nothing for long stretches of time. When he came home that night, his jacket was still dusted with gray powder, his hair tangled with sweat and debris. My mother ran to him, worry etched across her face, but he didn't say a word. He simply sat at the kitchen table, staring at his hands. I remember standing in the doorway, confused, waiting for him to smile the way he always did when he saw me. But his lips stayed still, trembling slightly as if holding back something too heavy to let out. The next morning, I overheard him speaking quietly to my mother. His voice was different, lower, slower, burdened. "It should have been me," he said. My mother tried to stop him, tried to remind him it was an accident, but he only repeated the words again and again, like a prayer he couldn't escape. Days passed, then weeks. My father returned to work sooner than anyone expected. He said he had to, that staying home made it worse. But something in him had changed. The man who once whistled in the mornings now dressed in silence. The man who once joked with me at dinner now barely spoke. His eyes had lost their warmth, replaced by something hollow and distant. He started spending his evenings alone on the porch, staring out into the yard. Sometimes he'd take out an old photo of him and David, arms around each other, grinning with the same carefree energy of men who believed they were unbreakable. He would hold that photo for a long time, his thumb tracing the edge of it as though touching the past could somehow undo it. I was too young then to understand grief. I thought maybe he was just tired or sick. I tried to cheer him up the only ways I knew how. I told him about school, about my grades, about the game I won. He would nod, but his smile never reached his eyes. The sparkle that used to make him look alive had dimmed completely. Once late at night, I heard him crying. My father, the strongest man I knew, the one who fixed everything, was sitting in the living room, shoulders shaking, trying to muffle his sobs. I froze in the hallway, not knowing what to do. My mother sat beside him, her hand on his back, whispering something I couldn't hear. It was the first time I saw how pain could make a person disappear, even while sitting right in front of you. After that, he began avoiding everyone, his coworkers, his friends, even church on Sundays. The accident had been ruled as unavoidable mechanical failure, but my father never accepted that. He had been the supervisor that day, responsible for safety checks. The thought that he might have missed something, that one overlooked detail had cost his best friend his life, haunted him endlessly. He stopped going to the construction site altogether a few months later. The company offered him desk work, but he refused. "I can't sit there," he told my mother. Not after what happened. He spent his days doing odd repairs around the house, things that didn't need fixing, as if mending the world around him could somehow mend the world inside him. We all felt the weight of his silence. Meals became quiet, laughter scarce. My mother tried to act normal, humming while she cooked, turning up the radio to fill the house with sound. But even music couldn't reach him anymore. It was as though the man we loved had been buried that same day, right beside his friend, leaving behind only a shadow that walked and breathed and carried the memory of who he used to be. Sometimes, when I looked at him sitting alone, I caught glimpses of that old smile struggling to find its way back, but it never did. He'd glance at me, his eyes soft for a second, then look away as if afraid to let me see the brokenness he carried. That's when I realized something I couldn't put into words back then. Grief doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just sits quietly, stealing the light from a man who once shone brightest. And so that winter, my father stopped smiling. Not because he didn't want to, but because the world had taken from him the very reason he used to. As weeks turned into months, the distance between my father and me grew wider than I could have imagined. It wasn't the kind of distance that could be measured in steps or words. It was quieter, heavier, something that settled between us like fog. He was there, physically, every day, sitting in his old chair by the window, reading the newspaper or pretending to. But the man I once knew, the one who used to lift me onto his shoulders and call me champ, seemed to have faded somewhere far beyond my reach. At first, I tried to tell myself it was temporary. People grieved and then they healed, or so I thought. I kept waiting for the day he'd crack a joke again, for the sound of his laughter to echo through the living room. But it never came. Every effort I made to reach him was like knocking on a door that would never open. I remember one Saturday morning, I asked if he'd come outside to play catch with me. We hadn't done that since the accident, and I thought maybe it would help. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I ran out to the yard, full of hope, gripping the baseball glove he had given me for my 12th birthday. When he finally came out, he looked tired, his face drawn. We tossed the ball back and forth a few times, the rhythm of it steady, simple, until one throw went a little too high. He reached for it, stumbled slightly, and froze. He stood there for a long time, staring at the ball lying in the grass. I called his name, but he didn't move. Then quietly he turned around and walked back inside. No explanation, no goodbye, just silence. I remember standing there confused and angry, clutching the ball in my hands, wondering what I had done wrong. That was the first time I felt the sting of rejection from him, though I didn't understand it was grief rejecting the world, not me. After that, our conversations shrank to single sentences. How was school? He'd ask without looking up. Fine, I'd answer, pretending not to notice how detached he sounded. Sometimes I caught him staring out the window, lost in a place I couldn't follow. Once I asked what he was thinking about, and he simply said, "Nothing you'd understand." That hurt more than I could say. My mother noticed it too. She would glance between us at dinner, her eyes full of quiet worry. She tried to bridge the gap, gently urging him to talk to me, to spend time together. But my father always brushed her off with the same tired line. "He's doing fine without me." I wanted to shout that I wasn't fine, that I needed him, but I couldn't find the courage. The silence in our house had become something sacred, untouchable, like walking through a room where someone had just died. I started spending more time outside, riding my bike aimlessly through the neighborhood, just to escape the stillness. Every time I came home, I hoped to find him smiling again, maybe humming like he used to when fixing things around the house. But instead, I'd find him sitting alone on the porch, a half-empty cup of coffee beside him, staring at the horizon as if searching for something that refused to appear. One evening, I gathered the courage to sit next to him. The air smelled like rain, and the sky was a soft orange fading into gray. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then I asked quietly, "Dad, do you still miss him?" His hands tightened around his cup. He didn't look at me. "Every day," he said. His voice cracked slightly, and then he added, "You don't understand what it's like to lose someone because of you." The words hit me hard. I didn't know what to say. My throat tightened and I looked down, trying to make sense of what he meant. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that everyone said it was an accident. But before I could, he stood up and went inside, leaving me alone with the sound of the wind and my own confusion. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words echoed in my head over and over, "Because of you." It wasn't directed at me, but somehow it felt like it was. I started wondering if maybe I reminded him too much of something, or someone. Maybe my laughter or my questions were just too loud in a world he wanted to keep quiet. Over time, I learned to stop expecting him to come back to who he was. I adapted to the silence. I did my homework alone, ate dinner without conversation, and went to bed without the old ritual of him tucking me in. My mother kept trying to bring him out of it, suggesting family outings, church gatherings, even therapy. But he refused everything. "I just need time," he would say. But time wasn't healing him. It was hardening him. His friends stopped coming by too. The laughter that used to echo through our house during card games or weekend barbecues vanished. People didn't know what to say to a man who had lost not just a friend, but a part of himself. My father became a ghost in his own home, alive but distant, trapped inside the cage of guilt he'd built around his heart. And yet, despite everything, I never stopped trying. I'd leave notes for him on the kitchen table, short messages like, "Good luck today," or "Love you, Dad." Sometimes he'd leave them where they were. Sometimes he'd scribble a quick thanks before crumpling it up. It wasn't much, but it was something. One day I overheard my parents arguing softly in the next room. My mother's voice was breaking as she said, "He needs you. You can't keep shutting him out." And my father replied, "He doesn't need a broken man teaching him how to live." That sentence stayed with me for years. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I didn't need a perfect father, just one who tried. But by then it seemed that trying was the one thing he couldn't do anymore. Seasons changed, but inside our home, time stood still. My father still woke up early, still fixed the same things that didn't need fixing, still carried the same heaviness in his eyes. But I kept hoping. Sometimes I thought I saw a flicker of light in him, like when he'd glance at me playing the guitar in the living room or when I caught him watching my baseball games from the car. He never cheered, never waved, but he was there. That, in its own quiet way, was proof that some part of him still cared. It took me years to understand that he wasn't pushing me away because he didn't love me. He was doing it because he did. He thought he was protecting me from his pain, from the guilt that ate at him every waking hour. But love mixed with silence can be cruel. It builds walls where bridges should be. And so, as I grew older, I stopped waiting for him to be the father he used to be. Instead, I began to see him as a man, flawed, wounded, and afraid. I realized that sometimes the people we love most don't know how to let us in, even when they want to. My father's distance wasn't a choice he made easily. It was a scar he carried, one he didn't know how to heal. But even then, in that unspoken space between us, I still loved him. And deep down, I believed that somewhere, buried beneath all that guilt and sorrow, he still loved me too. My mother was the quiet strength of our family, the one who never raised her voice, never complained, and never let her emotions spill in front of us, even when the weight on her shoulders grew too heavy. After my father's accident, it was as if she had been handed an impossible task, to hold together what was left of us when one of us had already fallen apart. And somehow she tried, every single day. In the early days after the tragedy, she moved through the house like someone trying to keep a fragile structure from collapsing. She would cook my father's favorite meals even though he barely touched them, wash and iron his work shirts even though he no longer wore them, and smile softly at me even when her eyes betrayed exhaustion. She seemed to believe that if she kept the rhythm of our lives steady enough, my father would eventually find his way back into it. But as the days passed, I could see the quiet panic growing behind her calm expression. Every morning, she'd watch him leave his chair by the window, hoping maybe that day he would look at her the way he used to. But his gaze always drifted past her, unfocused, distant. He'd take his coffee, mumble a thank you, and retreat to his world of silence. At first, she followed him into that silence, sitting beside him on the porch, her hand resting lightly on his. She tried to speak of ordinary things, weather, errands, neighbors, but he rarely answered. Eventually, she stopped trying to fill the air and instead just stayed close, hoping her presence would speak for her. One evening, I found her sitting alone in the kitchen long after dinner, her hands folded around a cold cup of tea. I asked her if she was okay. She smiled faintly and said, "I'm fine, sweetheart, just tired." But I noticed her eyes were red, the kind of redness that comes from holding back tears for too long. That was the first time I realized that while my father's grief was visible and loud in its silence, my mother's was quiet and hidden, tucked behind the need to stay strong for both of us. She began to live in two worlds, one where she pretended everything was normal for my sake, and another where she faced the truth alone. At dinner, she would ask about school, encourage me to talk, laugh at my small jokes even when they weren't funny. But when she thought I wasn't looking, she would glance at my father, and her smile would falter just slightly. It was like watching someone try to keep a candle burning in a storm. Sometimes, after I went to bed, I would hear their muffled conversations. She would beg him to open up, to let her in. "You don't have to carry it alone," she'd whisper. His response was always the same, a deep sigh followed by silence. Once she raised her voice, her words trembling. "Do you think you're the only one who lost something that day?" she said. "We all lost you too, and you're still here." I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding, realizing how broken things had become. But no matter how many times he withdrew, she never stopped trying. She took over paying the bills, managing the house, and making sure I didn't feel the cracks forming around us. She went back to her part-time job at the library, not because she needed the money, but because she said it helped her breathe again. I think it was her way of keeping the world from closing in too tightly. On weekends, she would sometimes suggest small family outings, a picnic at the park, a trip to the lake, a Sunday service. My father always declined. He'd mutter, "Maybe next time," and stay home staring at the same empty spot in the yard. She never argued. She would just nod, grab my hand, and say, "Then it'll just be us today." I could feel her disappointment, but she hid it behind a quiet grace that only mothers seem to have. Once I asked her if she was angry at him. She hesitated before answering. "I'm angry at what happened," she said softly. "But not at him. He's fighting a battle I can't see. And until he wins it or loses it, I'll be here." There was something both beautiful and heartbreaking in those words. It was love, stripped of its romance and left with only duty, patience, and pain. She began to keep a journal around that time. I'd see her writing late at night, sitting by the small lamp in the living room. She never let me read it, but I sometimes caught glimpses. Pages filled with steady handwriting, lines of prayers, notes to herself. Once I saw a single sentence written over and over, "I will not give up on him, but even the strongest hearts have their limits." One evening, after months of watching her try and fail to reach him, I found her standing in front of the sink, gripping the counter, her shoulders shaking. It was the first time I saw her cry openly. She turned when she realized I was there and quickly wiped her eyes. "It's okay," she said, forcing a smile. "Sometimes grown-ups get tired too." I didn't know what to say. I just hugged her, and she held me tighter than she ever had before, as if afraid I might disappear too. That night, I heard her praying softly in the next room. She wasn't asking for miracles, just for strength. For him to find peace, for me to keep believing, for the three of us to somehow make it through. It struck me how faith wasn't just about believing in God. It was about believing in people, even when they've forgotten how to believe in themselves. Over time, her approach changed. She stopped trying to fix him and started simply existing beside him. Instead of words, she offered quiet gestures. A warm meal left on the table, a gentle hand on his shoulder, a small smile when he did something ordinary, like changing a light bulb or fixing a loose board. It was as if she understood that love, when spoken too loudly, might scare him further into the shadows. Her strength wasn't loud or dramatic. It was found in the small things, the way she hummed while folding clothes, the way she kept the house clean and alive with fresh flowers, the way she reminded me to be kind to him even when I didn't understand why he deserved it. She carried all of us in her silence, refusing to let the family crumble completely. Looking back, I realized that my mother was the thread holding everything together. Without her patience, our family would have disintegrated. While my father sank into guilt and I drifted into confusion, she remained anchored. Her love was the quiet kind, the kind that endures even when it's not returned, the kind that stands in the ruins and says, "I'm still here." Years later, I came across that old journal while packing her things. On the last page, she had written something that summed her up perfectly. Sometimes love doesn't heal the broken. It simply keeps them company while they learn how to live again. And that was exactly what she did. She kept us company in the silence, in the grief, and in the long, slow wait for the day my father might find his smile again. It happened on a rainy afternoon, one of those slow, gray days when the house seemed to breathe sadness. I had come home from school early, the sky heavy with clouds and the air carrying the smell of wet earth. My father was out in the shed again, doing what he always did, fixing things that didn't need fixing. The sound of his hammer echoed faintly through the drizzle. My mother was at work, and for once the house was silent in a way that didn't feel oppressive. I don't know what made me go into his study that day. Maybe curiosity, maybe longing. Maybe I was just tired of not knowing the truth that had stolen his smile. The study was a small, cluttered room, filled with the ghosts of who my father used to be. Framed photographs of his crew lined the shelves, smiling men in hard hats, dust on their faces, pride in their eyes. There were blueprints rolled up on the desk, old notebooks filled with calculations, and tools carefully arranged in drawers. Everything was neat, precise, just like him before the accident. But what caught my attention was a small wooden box tucked in the corner of his desk drawer, the kind that looked handmade. The latch was worn, and I hesitated before opening it, knowing instinctively that whatever was inside might change how I saw him forever. Inside, I found an envelope, yellowed and creased with time. My father's name was written on the front in shaky handwriting, "To Michael." The sight of it made my stomach twist. I recognized the signature immediately. It was David's, my father's best friend. The man who had died that day. My hands trembled as I slid the letter out, unfolding the paper slowly, careful not to tear it. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. It wasn't a long letter, but every line carried weight. David had written it a few days before the accident, thanking my father for covering extra shifts for him, apologizing for putting too much pressure on him, and ending with a line that made my heart stop. "Don't worry about the inspection report. I know you'll handle it like you always do. You've got the best judgment out of all of us." The inspection report. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but it sounded important. I kept reading. Near the bottom, there was another line, one that seemed ordinary but in hindsight explained everything. "I'll take care of the cables tomorrow. They passed last time, so they should be fine." That was it, the cables, the ones that snapped. My father had told us they were being checked, that everything had been fine. But here was proof that David had been the one who said it, that he had taken responsibility, and yet my father had been the supervisor. The guilt must have eaten him alive. I sank into the chair, staring at the letter, feeling the world tilt around me. All this time, I had thought my father's silence came from grief alone. But it wasn't just that, it was guilt. He had trusted his best friend's word, and that trust had cost a life. It wasn't negligence, not exactly, it was human. But in his mind, it was unforgivable. For the first time, I understood the weight behind his eyes, the tremor in his hands, the distance in his voice. He wasn't angry at the world. He was angry at himself, and somehow that made me love him more and hurt for him even deeper. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. But before I closed it, I noticed a small photograph underneath, a picture of my father and David standing side by side at the construction site, grinning, holding their helmets high. Someone had scribbled a note on the back in my father's handwriting. "We built this together." The words broke something inside me. I sat there for a long time, crying quietly, because I finally understood what had stolen my father's smile. It wasn't death. It was betrayal of trust in the cruel way life punishes even honest men. When I heard the front door open, I quickly wiped my tears and returned the box to where it had been. My father's footsteps were heavy, his clothes damp from the rain. He didn't notice me at first. I stood there, frozen, unsure whether to tell him what I had found. But part of me knew that maybe he needed someone to know. Maybe he needed to be forgiven, even if he couldn't forgive himself. That evening, during dinner, I tried to bring it up without revealing that I had read the letter. "Dad," I said softly, "do you ever think people can forgive themselves for things that weren't really their fault?" He looked up for the first time in days, really looked at me. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, pain, recognition, maybe even fear. "Why do you ask that?" he said. I think sometimes people carry things they shouldn't have to," I replied. "Things that weren't their choice." For a moment he said nothing. Then he set down his fork, his hands trembling slightly. "There are some mistakes," he whispered, "that no amount of forgiveness can erase." I wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that forgiveness wasn't about erasing, it was about surviving. But I couldn't find the words. Instead, I reached across the table and put my hand over his. He didn't pull away. For the first time in years, he didn't. Later that night, I heard him moving around in his study. When I peeked in, he was sitting at the desk, the wooden box open in front of him. The letter lay beside him, unfolded. He was staring at it with tears running down his face. He didn't notice me watching. He pressed the letter to his chest, his body shaking with sobs that sounded raw, like years of pain finally breaking through. It was the first time I had ever seen him cry like that, and somehow it didn't make me pity him. It made me understand him. He wasn't the unbreakable man I had grown up believing he was. He was human. He had made a choice, one that ended in tragedy, and he had lived with it in silence ever since. But in that moment, with the rain outside and the letter in his hands, I saw the boy inside the man, lost, remorseful, and desperate for peace. He didn't know I had found the letter, and I never told him. But after that night, something began to shift between us. The silence was still there, but it felt different, softer, almost fragile. Sometimes he would meet my eyes at breakfast. Sometimes he would sit next to me on the porch, not talking, just being there. I think, in some unspoken way, he knew that I understood now. And understanding, even without words, is a kind of forgiveness. It doesn't erase the past, but it lets two people begin to live again, side by side within the ache, instead of apart from it. It was a late evening in early spring when everything finally came to the surface. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of blooming jasmine from the garden my mother had planted years ago. My father was sitting alone on the porch, as he often did, staring at the sky as if searching for something lost among the stars. I had spent the entire day pacing my room, replaying that letter over and over in my mind, the words written by David echoing like a haunting melody I couldn't silence. I couldn't bear the weight of knowing what I knew and saying nothing anymore. It felt like a wound festering in both of us, and silence had stopped being protection. It had become poison. When I stepped out onto the porch, he didn't look at me. He was holding his coffee cup, long gone cold, cradling it like it still offered warmth. For a moment I hesitated, unsure of how to begin. I didn't want to hurt him, but I knew that keeping quiet was another kind of cruelty. "Dad," I said finally, my voice trembling more than I expected. "Can I talk to you about something?" He nodded slightly, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Sure," he murmured, though it sounded more like a formality than an invitation. I sat down beside him, feeling the wooden steps creak beneath our weight. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then before I could lose my courage, I said softly, "I found the letter." He froze. His hands tightened around the cup, and for a long time he didn't move. "What letter?" he asked, though his voice cracked in a way that told me he already knew. "The one from David," I said. "The one in your desk." The air between us went still, and for the first time in years he looked at me fully. His eyes were wide, raw, almost frightened. "You shouldn't have read that," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I know," I said, my throat tight. "But I had to. I needed to understand. I needed to know what really happened." He turned away, rubbing a hand over his face, his shoulders trembling. "There's nothing to understand," he said. I failed him. "That's all there is." "No, you didn't," I said quickly, leaning forward. "You trusted him. You trusted your best friend. That's not failure, Dad. That's what people do when they care about each other. It was an accident." He shook his head violently, his voice rising for the first time in years. "An accident?" he said bitterly. "Is that what they call it? I was the supervisor. I was supposed to double-check everything. I was supposed to make sure that everyone went home safe that day. I didn't, and because of that he's dead. He's gone, and I'm still here." The words tore out of him like a confession, raw and jagged. His hands were shaking so badly the cup slipped from his grasp and rolled onto the porch, spilling what little remained. He didn't notice. His chest was heaving, his eyes burning with tears that refused to fall. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "He was your friend, Dad. He trusted you just like you trusted him. If he were here, do you really think he'd want you to live like this? To keep punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault?" He let out a low, broken laugh that sounded more like a sob. "You don't understand, son. You don't know what it's like to carry someone's life in your hands and realize you dropped it. Every time I close my eyes, I see him there. I hear the sound of that cable snapping. I see the dust rising. I see his face. And no matter what anyone says, it always ends the same. He's gone, and I couldn't save him." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. The weight of his words pressed down on me, and I realized that this was the pain he had been living with every day since that moment, the endless replay of something that could never be undone. But I also saw something else beneath the guilt. Love. The kind of love that had broken him because it had been real, deep, and loyal. I took a slow breath and said softly, "You couldn't save him, but that doesn't mean you have to lose yourself too." He wouldn't have wanted that. He looked at me again, and this time tears finally spilled down his cheeks. He didn't try to wipe them away. "I don't know how to stop," he whispered. "I've forgotten how to live without the guilt. It's the only thing that's kept me company all these years." I reached for his hand, hesitant at first, afraid he might pull away. But he didn't. His hand was rough and cold, the hand of a man who had carried too much for too long. "Then let me carry some of it with you," I said. "You don't have to hold it alone anymore." For a long time, he didn't respond. The sound of rain began again, light at first, then steady. He stared out into the night, his breathing uneven. Finally, he said, barely audible, "I wish I could believe that. I wish I could forgive myself. But I can't. I don't deserve it." "You do," I said, my voice shaking. "You're my father. You taught me how to be kind, how to work hard, how to stand up for what's right. That man you were, he's still in there somewhere. You're just too hurt to see it." He looked at me with such sorrow in his eyes that it felt like the world had stopped turning. "You shouldn't have to see me like this," he said softly. "You should remember me how I was before." "I can't," I said, "because that man doesn't exist without this version of you. You're both the same person, Dad. the one who laughed and the one who broke. I loved both of them. That was the moment something inside him cracked, not in a way that shattered, but in a way that released. He covered his face with his hands and sobbed openly, his body shaking with years of suppressed pain. I moved closer, wrapping my arms around him like I used to when I was little, when he was the one who comforted me. Now it was my turn. He didn't resist. He just cried into my shoulder, whispering things I could barely understand. Apologies, regrets, fragments of memories that had haunted him for too long. It felt like time had stopped, like the rain and the darkness were witnesses to something sacred. For the first time since I could remember, my father wasn't a silent, distant man. He was human again, flawed, grieving, real. When he finally calmed down, he whispered, "I didn't know how to tell you. I thought you'd hate me." I shook my head. "I could never hate you," I said. "You're my dad. You made a mistake, but you've been paying for it every day since. That's not hate. That's love in its hardest form." He exhaled shakily, his grip on my hand tightening. "You sound just like your mother," he said with a faint, broken smile. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. The first smile I had seen on his face in years. We sat there for a long time, not speaking, just breathing the same cool air, listening to the rain against the roof. The silence felt different now. No longer cold, no longer a wall, but a fragile kind of peace. He wasn't healed, not completely, but something had shifted. The confession had lifted a part of the weight he had carried. And I could feel it too, lighter somehow, as if the truth itself had given both of us room to breathe again. That night, before I went to bed, I glanced back at him one last time. He was still sitting there, looking up at the sky, but this time there was softness in his eyes, a kind of quiet acceptance. For the first time, I realized that maybe healing doesn't always come in big moments. Sometimes it comes in a single breath, a single touch, or a single truth finally spoken aloud. The morning after our conversation, I woke to the soft sound of birds outside my window. The house felt unusually calm, like the tension that had gripped it for years had finally loosened its hold. For a moment, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling the faint warmth of sunlight filtering through the curtains. It was strange. After years of carrying my father's silence like a weight on my chest, there was finally space to breathe. When I walked into the kitchen, he was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. But something was different. His shoulders weren't as hunched. His gaze wasn't fixed on some faraway place. He looked up when I entered and actually smiled. Not the empty, polite kind of smile I had seen him wear to make others comfortable, but a small, real one. It was faint and weary, but it was his. "Morning," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Morning," I replied, hesitating at the doorway. I wasn't sure how to act around him now. After everything that had been said, the air between us felt fragile, like glass. I poured myself some coffee and sat across from him. He sipped his drink in silence for a moment before speaking. "I didn't sleep much," he said, "but for the first time in a long while, I didn't dream about that day." I looked at him surprised. He nodded slowly, almost to himself. "It's strange," he continued. "I thought if I ever let it out, if I ever said it aloud, it would destroy me. But it didn't. It hurts, but in a different way now. Not like before. I didn't know what to say." The pain in his voice was still there, but it had changed, like a wound that had finally begun to scab over after years of bleeding. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I recognized it instantly. The letter from David. My stomach twisted, thinking of how much that single page had haunted both of us. "I want you to have this," he said, sliding it across the table. I shook my head. "No, Dad, that's yours." He smiled faintly. "It was mine, but not anymore. It's time I let it go." I hesitated before picking it up. The paper was soft from being handled too much. The ink slightly faded. "Are you sure?" I asked. He nodded. "I've spent years reading and rereading that letter, punishing myself with every word. But when I look at it now, I don't see guilt. I see friendship. I see trust. I see a man who forgave me long before I ever forgave myself." He took a long breath and stared out the window. "I'm tired of living like a ghost," he whispered. "Your mother wouldn't want that. David wouldn't want that, and you deserve a father who's still here." The words hit me harder than I expected. I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to speak. "You've always been here, Dad," I said softly. "You just stopped seeing yourself." He chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "You sound wiser than your age. Maybe I did raise you right after all." We sat in silence for a while, sipping our coffee, listening to the wind move through the trees. It wasn't a perfect morning. Nothing about life ever is, but it felt real. And after everything, real was enough. Later that day, I found him in the garden. He was kneeling in the dirt, pruning the rose bushes my mother used to tend to. I hadn't seen him out there in years. For so long, the garden had been a place of ghosts, filled with memories he couldn't face. But now he was there, gently cutting away dead leaves, giving the plants space to bloom again. I stood in the doorway for a while, just watching him. The way he moved was slower, more deliberate, but there was purpose in every motion. When he looked up and saw me, he smiled again. "She used to hum when she did this," he said, his voice distant but soft. I could never get the tune out of my head. I walked over and crouched beside him. "Teach me," I said. "Show me how she used to do it." He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. We worked side by side, trimming and watering, not talking much. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was gentle, filled with the kind of understanding words can't always express. Every cut of the shears, every petal that fell to the soil, felt like a release, like letting go of something old to make room for something new. When we finished, the garden looked alive again, even though most of the flowers hadn't yet bloomed. My father wiped his hands on his jeans and straightened up, breathing hard but smiling. "She'd be proud," he said quietly. "I think she would too," I replied. That night, as the sun set, I found him back on the porch. The same place where he had spent countless evenings lost in regret, but this time the atmosphere was different. He had a small radio playing an old song, one I remembered from my childhood. The melody drifted through the cool air, wrapping around the house like a familiar embrace. I sat beside him, and for a long time we didn't speak. We didn't need to. He was smiling again. Not wide, not carefree, but a soft, peaceful smile that seemed to come from deep inside. It was the kind of smile that said, "I'm still here. I made it through." As the stars appeared one by one, he said, "You know, I used to think my life ended the day David died. But maybe it was just paused. Maybe it's time to start living again." I nodded, my eyes stinging. "It's never too late, Dad." He looked at me then, and his expression softened. "You saved me, you know," he said. "All this time I thought I was protecting you from the truth. Turns out you were the one who brought me back to it." I smiled, swallowing hard. We saved each other. He reached over and patted my shoulder gently. "Thank you, son," he whispered. We stayed there until the night deepened, talking about memories we had avoided for years, stories about my mother, about his old job, about the dreams he once had before the guilt swallowed them. And for the first time in so long, the laughter that filled the air wasn't forced. It was real, warm, healing. Before going inside, I looked back at him one last time. He was staring at the stars again, but this time his face wasn't haunted. His smile lingered in the dim light, quiet but strong, like someone finally at peace with his past. And in that moment, I realized something. Sometimes the people we love don't need us to fix them. They just need us to sit beside them long enough for them to remember who they are. That night, when I turned off my light and lay down, I thought about the years we'd lost and the time we still had. My father had stopped smiling once, broken by guilt and silence. But now, seeing him rediscover the simple joy of being alive, I knew his smile had returned not because the pain was gone, but because he had finally learned to live with it. And maybe that's what healing really is. Not forgetting the past, but finding the strength to smile in spite of it.